You put $10,000 in a savings account at one of the biggest banks in America, and at the end of the year, you earned $1. One. The same bank took your money, lent it out as credit cards at 20% interest, and posted record profits. So today I'm breaking down exactly how they pull this off and why it's not an accident, starting with the number that should make you angry. The headline contrast. Here's a fact that sounds made up but isn't. For much of 2010 through early 2022, the largest retail banks in America paid between 0.01 and 0.10% on standard savings accounts. At 0.01%, your $10,000 earned you $1 per year, not per month, then per year. Meanwhile, that same institution was originating credit card loans at 15 to 25% APR, auto loans at 3 to 7%, and mortgages at 4 to 5%. The spread between what they paid you and what they charged everyone else was enormous. And this isn't some fringe operation. US commercial banks collectively earned over $200 billion in annual net income in recent years. The top 4 banks alone control a massive share of all domestic deposits. They don't need to compete on rates because most depositors stay out of pure habit, convenience, or the vague feeling that big means safe. But here's where it gets interesting. These same banks allocate billions every year to stock buybacks, dividends, and executive compensation. Not reinvesting in better rates for the people whose money literally forms the foundation of their balance sheet. Your deposits are the raw material. You're the supply chain. And you're getting paid $1 a year for it. This isn't conspiracy, it's structure. And to understand why it works, we need to look at how banks actually function behind the scenes. How banks actually work. Here's what most people picture when they think about their bank account. A vault somewhere with their name on a little pile of cash. That's not even close to reality. When you deposit $1,000, the bank records 2 things simultaneously. A liability, meaning they owe you that money back. And an asset, meaning they now have $1,000 they can put to work. Now, the textbook explanation says banks keep 10% and lend out 90%. Neat, clean, simple. Turns out, no. The United States eliminated reserve requirements entirely in March 2020, 0%. Banks are now constrained by capital requirements and liquidity rules, not by some fraction of your deposit sitting in a back room. But here's where it gets really weird. Banks don't actually check a pool of money before making a loan. When a bank approves a $10,000 loan, it creates the loan and a brand new deposit in the borrower's account at the same time. Both sides of the balance sheet expand simultaneously. They're not intermediaries moving money from point A to point B. They're creating money when they lend, so your deposit is simultaneously real and completely abstract. You can withdraw it anytime. But the bank has already transformed it into a liquid 30-year mortgages and long-term securities. This is called maturity transformation, and it's the reason a bank run can collapse the entire system in 48 hours. Deposit insurance exists, sure, but it works on one assumption, that everyone won't show up at once, which is, not ideal. But understanding the plumbing is only half the picture. The real question is how much profit banks extract from this structure, and the answer lives in 3 letters that nobody outside finance ever talks about. Net interest margin. Here's where we get to the actual engine that makes this whole thing work. And honestly, it's almost embarrassingly simple. Banks have a metric called net interest margin. You take the interest income they earn on their assets, subtract the interest they pay out to depositors and creditors, then divide that by their total interest earning assets. That's it. That's the formula. And it typically lands somewhere between 2 and 4% for large commercial banks. Now, 3% sounds like nothing. It sounds like something you'd fall asleep reading about in a quarterly report. But here's where the scale makes it obscene. A bank with $1 trillion in assets running a 3% net interest margin generates $30 billion in net interest income annually. Before expenses, before losses, before taxes, $30 billion from a 3% spread. The trick was never about extracting a huge percentage from each transaction. It's about applying a moderate spread across a massive flow of funds. A 2.5% margin on $2 trillion in assets equals $50 billion. That's not a rounding error, that's a fortune built on fractions. And this is exactly why banks fight so hard to keep your savings rate low. If a large bank raised deposit rates by just 1 percentage point on $1 trillion in deposits, that's $10 billion gone per year. That's not a minor line item, that's an enormous chunk of shareholder returns evaporating because they decided to be slightly less stingy with your money, which is, not ideal for the quarterly earnings call. But understanding the margin is only half the picture. The real question is why your savings rate never catches up, even when interest rates climb. And the answer to that is somehow even more frustrating. Why? Savings rates never keep up. There's a term that banking analysts use called deposit beta, and once you understand it, the whole game falls apart. Deposit beta measures how much of a central bank rate hike actually gets passed along to you, the depositor. A beta of 1 would mean you get the full raise. Fair, right? But here's the thing. For standard retail savings accounts at large banks, deposit betas typically sit between 0.125 and 0.25. The Fed raises rates by 4 percentage points, and your savings account goes up by maybe half a point. Maybe a full point if your bank is feeling generous. They pocket the rest, and the reason they get away with it is painfully simple. Behavioral inertia. If you got $3,000 in savings, a 2 percentage point rate increase means an extra $60 a year. That's not enough to make most people spend an afternoon researching alternatives and filling out applications. Banks know this, they've done the math on your apathy, and the math works out great for them. But here's where it gets dark. The same institution paying you 0.1% on your basic savings account is simultaneously offering 0.5 to 1.0% on a premier tier for wealthier clients. They've got an online-only product paying 3 to 4%. And behind closed doors, their institutional desk is negotiating even higher rates with corporate depositors who can move billions into treasuries with a phone call. Large, sophisticated depositors are rate sensitive, so banks pay them properly. They can walk, so they get treated like adults. You, with your $3,000 balance, are the sticky, cheap funding pool they depend on for margin. They're not hiding better rates from you. Exactly, they're just counting on you never asking, which is, not ideal. But if you think the deposit side is where banks stop getting creative with your money, wait until you hear about the switch they pulled on their entire business model. The switch. For most of the 20th century, banks had one job: take deposits, make loans, collect the spread. Net interest income accounted for over 80% of a typical commercial bank's revenue. Simple, predictable, boring. But somewhere around the 1980s, someone in a boardroom looked at the numbers and thought, why stop there? Deregulation changed everything. Starting in the 80s and accelerating through the 90s, banks were allowed to expand into investment banking, securities underwriting, derivatives trading, and asset management. They went from being the equivalent of a corner shop to running an entire shopping mall. By the 2000s, non-interest income had ballooned to 40, sometimes 50% of total revenue at large universal banks. These weren't lending institutions anymore, they were financial conglomerates wearing a friendly retail mask. And here's where it gets personal. One of the most reliable new revenue streams: overdraft fees. Some institutions were pulling in multiple billions per year just from customers who accidentally spent more than they had. You overdraw your account by $30 buying groceries, the bank charges you $35 for the privilege. That's not a fee. That's a short-term loan at an annualized rate that would make a loan shark blush. Cool. Add that to the list. Then there was trading. Before 2008, proprietary trading desks were essentially gambling with the firm's own money. It worked beautifully until it didn't. Post-crisis regulations like the Volcker Rule reined in the most aggressive prop trading, but market making and structured products remained highly profitable. The casino just got a slightly smaller sign out front. Now, here's the kicker. You'd think all this extra income would trickle down to depositors. If a bank is making billions from trading and overdraft charges, maybe it could afford to pay you 3% instead of 0.01%. Turns out, no. The additional profits went exactly where you'd expect: dividends, stock buybacks, executive compensation. Diversification didn't make banks more generous, it just gave shareholders another income stream while your savings account stayed frozen at functionally zero. But if you think the business model is the whole story, wait until you see how banks make sure the rules never change. The regulatory capture. So if the system is this tilted, why doesn't regulation fix it? Why doesn't someone in a government building somewhere say, hey, maybe depositors should get more than $1 a year on their savings? Here's the thing, the banks got to that building first. The US financial sector spends hundreds of millions of dollars annually on federal lobbying alone, not occasionally, every single year. Similar patterns play out in the EU and across every advanced economy with a major banking sector. And it's not just the money, it's the people. Former regulators routinely take well-paid positions at the very banks they once oversaw. Former bank executives slide into regulatory roles. The revolving door spins so fast it could power a small city. But here's where it gets structural rather than conspiratorial. Take the Basel Capital Standards, the international rules that determine how much backup capital banks need to hold. Large banks don't just comply with these rules, they help write them. Through consultation processes, they advocate for risk weighting, schemes that assign conveniently low capital charges to the exact assets they want to load up on. Assets funded by, you guessed it, cheap deposits. The rules aren't being broken, they're being shaped at the source. On the consumer side, banks have fought aggressively against standardized fee disclosures, explicit overdraft consent requirements, and fee caps. Their argument that such rules would eliminate free checking accounts or force branch closures. Which sounds reasonable until you remember these institutions are clearing tens of billions in profit annually. I don't know what to tell you, but the sharpest insight isn't that regulators are corrupt or incompetent, it's that they're solving a different problem entirely. Financial regulation is designed around safety and soundness. The mandate is making sure banks don't collapse and take the economy with them. It is not, and has never been, about ensuring depositors capture a fair share of the surplus. Regulators are protecting the bank's solvency, not your yield. Two completely different mandates that people assume are the same thing, they're not even close. So the system doesn't self-correct because the correction mechanism was never pointed at you in the first place. But if all of this sounds hopeless, the next section might help. What you can actually do. Here's the thing, the gap between earning 0.01% and earning 4% on your savings isn't hidden behind some complex financial barrier, it's hidden behind inertia. You opened that account when you were 19 because the branch was near your apartment and you never thought about it again. That's the entire strategy banks are counting on. So let's map out what actually exists. High-yield online savings accounts offer 3 to 4 percentage points above what the big banks pay. Same deposit insurance, same government backing. The trade-off is no physical branch, which, let's be honest, you haven't walked into one in 3 years anyway. Your $10,000 earns $400 a year instead of $1. Credit unions are member-owned cooperatives. No shareholders demanding maximum extraction. Surplus gets returned as higher deposit rates and lower fees. When major banks paid 0.01%, many credit unions were paying 0.5 to 1.5%. Not life-changing, but considerably less insulting. Money market funds invest in short-term government debt and track benchmark rates closely. When policy rates sit at 5%, these funds pay something in that neighborhood. The catch? No deposit insurance, and rare documented instances of funds breaking the buck. Rare, but real. You can also just buy treasury bills directly. They yield almost exactly the policy rate. Minimal credit risk. The government would have to collapse for you to lose money, and if that happens, your savings account isn't helping you either. The pattern is obvious. Every one of these options existed the entire time you were earning nothing. The barrier was never access, it was awareness and friction. But here's where it gets interesting. Proposals already exist that would close this gap structurally. Central bank digital wallets, paying policy rate returns directly to citizens. Postal banking through existing infrastructure. These aren't fantasy, they're drafted policy. They just haven't been implemented because the institutions profiting from the gap have significant influence over the people who'd need to approve the change. Banks make $200 billion a year partly because doing nothing is the default. And doing nothing is extremely profitable for them. The solutions exist, the alternatives exist, I don't know what to tell you. Probably both. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.